Hello, and welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Donald Grodoff, Behavior Transformation Specialist and Mindful Liberator with Focused Healthy Family, Family OCD, and Natural Anxiety Disorder Treatment Center. My goal with these podcasts is to bring about awareness about OCD and anxiety disorders. I am not a doctor or a therapist. I'm a specialist helping clients get liberated from OCD and anxiety. The messages here are not necessarily the opinion of myself or my services. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's join that podcast. I have the great pleasure of introducing you today to Natasha Daniels. Natasha Daniels is an anxiety and OCD child therapist and a mom to 3 kids with anxiety and OCD. She is the host of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, the creator of the AT Parenting Survival website, and her kids' YouTube channel, Ask the Child Therapist. When she is not in her practice, she is busy creating online resources and support for parents raising kids with anxiety or OCD. Let's join that interview now. So Natasha, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I welcome you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
The first thing I like to start out with, Natasha, is I always like to try to give my audience a personal glance at the person I'm interviewing. So I don't know if you'd want to share a personal story or something about yourself to help my audience kind of get a view of you.
Yeah, there's so many personal stories, but I'll just try to pick one. I grew up with a severely mentally ill dad. So my dad was like bipolar and I think, went to a lot of psych hospitals. So I think that's why I wanted to become a therapist. And then I got into helping kids with anxiety and OCD early on. Then I had 3 kids after that who wound up having anxiety and OCD. My 2 youngest, I have an 8, 10, and 16-year-old. So my 16-year-old has social anxiety and panic disorder. She's doing really well. My 8 and 10-year-olds, those are kind of my front burner issues. My 10-year-old has PANS as well. We have a lot of autoimmune issues. He was diagnosed with PANS a couple of years ago and has ARFID, which is impacting his eating. We deal with that a lot. And I feel like I have a lot of hands-on experience. So I eat, live, and breathe anxiety and OCD because I'm trying to help the world and people in my practice, but then I go home and I have to help my own kids and myself, with an anxiety disorder myself. We're like 31 flavors of anxiety and OCD over here.
Somehow I can relate to that with 2 kids of OCD myself. In coaching work I try to help people with OCD, but I also have to go home and do the battles that we have at home. And you mentioned, and I just to help clarify what you said, RFED. Would you mind just real quickly kind of what that is?
ARFID is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. To me, it's a throwaway diagnosis. This is kind of my own bias because you can have ARFID. These are quotation marks for podcast viewers. And you can have it for so many different reasons. They used to call it selective eating disorder, and now they're calling it ARFID. But you can have sensory issues and have ARFID. But a lot of kids with PANS or PANDAS have eating issues. So that they kind of go hand in hand.
So you're a therapist that specializes in working with kids with anxiety and OCD especially.
Right. Yeah.
What are the techniques you use in helping children and families through the OCD?
I really try to empower the child. Like that, my ultimate goal is to empower the child. I always talk to kids and say, I want you to be the expert. I want you to be a mini Natasha. I want you to grow up into, you could be an OCD therapist if you wanted to, because you know so much about this. Even 6, 7-year-olds, I want them to be an expert. So a lot of my approach is really focusing on training wheels, getting them to understand what ERP is, exposure response prevention. I start off getting them to understand what OCD is, and not just in a very simplistic way, but how it goats you in, how it hooks you in, how it will fool you, how it will want you to feed it. And I use a lot of analogies with little kids to get them to see that in a very kid-friendly sort of way. And then I want the parent to be a coach to that child. And I always say to the parent, I'm coaching you so that you can coach them, so that ultimately they can kind of be independent with this. We do a lot of education, a lot of exposures.
Okay. Now you mentioned ERP, which I've talked about and done podcast on of quite a few actually, because it's, to me, of course, is the gold standard, I guess, for OCD. Are there other techniques like I don't know if you do like ACT or any of the other that go along with ERP?
Yeah, I'm not an ACT therapist, and to be honest, I didn't jump on that bandwagon early as everyone else did. As I have gotten more, as I've learned more and more about ACT, I realized that I incorporate that anyway. I think a lot of OCD therapists a good OCD therapist naturally incorporates ACT principles. I'm doing it more with intention now, because I think the ACT community has brought a lot of good analogies. They brought a lot of good awareness to mindfulness and to focusing on what kids want. It's a really good motivator. Yeah, I never was an ACT therapist. Tapping into what motivates kids, how is OCD getting in the way of the things that you love, and using exposures for things that they want to do are things that I already did, but they're very ACT based. To start with a child and say, if you could change anything, if OCD is really bothering you, what is it getting in the way of? Because a lot of kids will say OCD is keeping me safe. And so it's, trying to figure out what part is upsetting you. Well, I really wish I could go over to my friend's house. Okay, well, let's start with that. So I do like that ACT principle of starting where OCD is impacting something they enjoy to choose from.
And you work with small kids, so I was just curious, and you've touched upon some of it, but I was wondering if you could give a little more information of what's different about working with a small child, like you said, 5, 6, maybe 8, versus a teenager or an adult. What do you see the difference is in how you would treat them versus, like, say, an adult?
Little kids really need to be entertained, and they need to be motivated. They're not going to, if you say to them, this could take over your life, this is going to be so detrimental, they could care less, because a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old is in the now. They're like totally in the moment. You have to use better metaphors with them so they can understand it. So, and you have to be silly, you have to engage them, because it has to be fun, or they're not going to want to come back to therapy. Or if you're doing it at home as a parent, they're going to be hiding their compulsions because they're going to think you're the OCD police. If you don't gamify it on some level, there'll be no buy-in. With my kids at home and the kids in my practice, we do tickets, like carnival tickets, and they're earning tickets for exposures all the time. It's part of our vernacular, like, hey, do you want to take a challenge? Do you want to squash squishy? We have a lot of weird language. That was your O cloud. All of my kids have different names for their OCD, so that gets kind of interesting. They're like almost other family members that are not wanted in our house. Yeah, I think you do have to gamify it with some behavior modification, which means kids earn stuff. And most OCD therapists who are working with kids will gamify it on some level.
I like the O cloud. That's it. That's
Yeah. It started out as a worry cloud, and then she was diagnosed with OCD, and I was like, oh man.
well, we turned one of them for my daughter way back. We turned it into Voldemort
Oh, I like
from
that.
Harry Potter, and one of the big things I used in that with her with that was I told her the big thing about, and not to give spoilers, but with Harry Potter was that he had the love of his mother. That was how he, like kind of defeated Voldemort. And so I would tell my daughter, I said, that's your way of defeating OCD, is you have that love. It doesn't have it, and that's the power that you have. And
I
that
like
seemed to help her. I like that, oh Cloud. I'll have to remember that one.
that.
Talk a little bit, if you would, how you deal with pans and pandas, because that's what we've run into also. Is there different techniques or different things you do with the pans or pandas? And if you wouldn't mind, just for our audience today, I've gone over it before, but remind us what pans and pandas is, and then how you might deal with that, and is it different?
I'm not a pandas and pans expert, but if you work with kids and you work with OCD, it's something you have to understand on some level. And parentally, obviously, I have gone down that journey. So I can speak both as a parent and a clinician. PANDAS and PANS, well, PANDAS is having an infection. It's all about having some sort of infection or autoimmune response that is causing some inflammation in the brain, which can impact the basal ganglia and cause OCD-like behavior with some other symptoms as well. So with PANDAS, it's a strep infection that could have happened a long time ago that went unchecked. That's causing some inflammation. With PANS, PANS is more ambiguous. It can be some sort of autoimmune condition, because with autoimmune conditions, you have inflammation. And with you have inflammation, if I have Hashimoto's and I'm having some issues with my thyroid, why can't I have an autoimmune issue with my brain? It's really not a big leap. Or my daughter has celiac, so these are all autoimmune issues. One of the symptoms is OCD-like behavior. There are other issues too, bedwetting or some incontinence. There is some motor issues. There are other issues. And so when I'm working with a child with PANDAS or PANS, we have to address the medical component. So a lot of times if they don't already have the support of the medical community, I'll connect them to a good, luckily here in Arizona, we have the CPAE clinic, which is really one of the best, I think, PANDAS and PANS clinics. So we're fortunate in that. So I'll make sure that they're connected. And if they're not, well, I only see people in Arizona as far as therapy goes. So that's kind of nice. But then a lot of times ERP won't work as well initially for kids with PANDAS and PANS. Some of it is ancillary support, like giving the parent support, because there's rages. With PANDAS and PANS, a lot of kids have a lot of dysregulation, right? And so how are you going to deal with that? And you can't deal with it in the typical parenting way. And some therapists who don't understand PANDAS and PANS might give you typical parenting approaches, which will really make you feel frustrated because they're not going to work when your child is literally kind of gone in those moments. I do work with a lot of support, parenting support, sibling support, and then doing ERP very slow so that there is some movement, but and educating the child too on what PANDAS and PANS is.
That touches home very, very much, because that's what we went through. And a lot of what we had to do started with diet too, getting the diet changed over, because that was affecting a lot of the rages like you talked about. But I fully understand that. Well, the other thing, going through what we're going through at the present time with this pandemic crisis, I was wondering, and I may want to look at it even in a broader sense, is when you run into a heavy trauma situation, heavy crisis situation like we're going through right now, because of course this recording will probably go on forever, so this particular pandemic will be done. But does it change how you, especially with OCD, does it change how you approach that, or how does it affect that?
I've been surprised so far, and I really feel like we're kind of in the early days of this pandemic. As of this day, I've been surprised at how well the kids I'm working with in my practice are doing. They're just doing better than I thought. And I think part of that is because they're dealing with these kind of battles on a daily basis anyway. Like the sky is falling for them 24/7. So to them, they live in this panic. So I have been surprised that I'm not seeing as many kids have flare-ups or have bigger issues with their OCD. They're all still worried about their themes that are pretty unrelated. Unless they have this particular theme, they're not being impacted. I do feel like, though, in general, because there's a heightened anxiety globally, parents are anxious. You can't not soak that up on some level. I have noticed, at least in my own home, and I'm not sure I'll start to see it in my practice, but where my kids' anxiety levels have increased. My son is having eating issues again, whether that's just a coincidence or whether he's just soaking up the anxiety that's going on, who knows? And my 8-year-old, some of her themes are popping back too. They're also home all the time, and downtime is really the enemy to anxiety and OCD. I mean, it's awesome exposure, because when I'm working with kids and I really want to get them advanced and they're doing really well, we'll do like 30-minute downtime just to sit on your bed, because kids use distraction so much as kind of a compulsion that I try to quiet their activity down as I feel like they can handle it. Now, all the kids have to have that, whether they're ready for that or not. And that's going to impact kids. And I think parents are going to have to eventually, once the dust settles and people get into their new normal, which I think might be for a while, I think we're going to have to work on our kids' OCD stuff at home because we're going to see it a lot more.
I also know that you do a lot. You have your own podcast. You put out a lot of videos and information for helping people, resources for. How did you get into that? How did the podcast start, and what was your reasoning for doing it?
Actually, the reason for my podcast, to be totally honest, was out of laziness because I started my blog in 2015 because I wrote a book on anxious toddlers and they wanted me to create a website. And I wasn't really into toddlers. I just wrote that book. Then I got into this hamster wheel of having to write 3 articles a week for this website. I'd much rather connect with people through talking. In 2017, I was like, I'm just so done with this hamster wheel. I want to provide content, but I'd rather be real and I want people to know me. I want to be more personable. And so that's when I started the podcast and I stopped writing.
I can talk about OCD all day, but I wanted to first off just see, is there any other message you would like to get out to an OCD audience?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that you have power. I think a lot of times we give our power away, and I'm talking as a parent now, not as a therapist, to professionals, to other people. And I think parents doubt themselves, and they can get educated just like anybody else can. They can get tools. It's nice to get the therapy support for sure, but that doesn't mean that you sit back idly and let this run in the background. I think OCD, I always say it's a family sport, and it has to be, because if you don't jump into that game will never be won, and you can't really win OCD, but you're not going to feel like triumphant. Rolling up your sleeves, understanding OCD, and coaching your child to help themselves. And I think that's an integral part too, that we want our kids to be independent. We don't want to do this stuff for them or force it on them. We want to really make it intrinsically motivating eventually.
That's wonderful. I agree totally. That's what we had to do, and we still are doing, empowering ourselves and empowering our child to really. My wife has always been one to say they have to solve it, not us. She also gave me the idea of I call the compassionate coach. She said you can't do it military style. You want to be remember that the child is in there. Your son, your daughter is within that beast of OCD, and deal with it in a compassionate way. So that's wonderful advice. And Natasha, I would like to give you the opportunity to let people know how they can find you. If you want to give your website, your podcast information. I'll also, just to remind the audience, I will have it up on the website, theinvisiblewheelchair.com, so that you can find it there too. But if you want to just put it out there, that would be great.
Yeah, the easiest way to find me is on my website at atparentsurvivalpodcast.com.
Okay, and I think your podcast, everything can be found right from there, correct?
Yep, it's I have links to my podcast. It's because I don't write anymore unless I'm writing a book, and so I just publish my podcasts up on my website, as well as iTunes, Google Play, that kind of stuff.
That's great. Well, Natasha, I want to thank you. This has been very informative, and I enjoyed talking with you, and I appreciate you being part of this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email don@invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts, with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archive past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, familyocd.com or focusedhealthyfamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at FamilyOCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.